Welcome to the Software People Stories. I'm Shiv.
I'm Chitra.
And I'm Gayatri.
We bring you interesting, untold stories of people
Associated with the creation
Or consumption of software-based solutions.
You'll hear stories of what worked,
and sometimes what didn't,
you will also hear very personal experiences.
and insights that would trigger your thoughts
And inspire you to do even greater things.
A techie, entrepreneur, and coder since his childhood, Sunil Mukundan joined a friend to start building an electronic stethoscope. And in addition to learning the ins and outs of software, he also learned about hardware and its integration with software. His wealth of experience is fascinating to listen to, as he talks about being in a startup and having customers buying your product as a priceless first-hand experience. His approach to software architecture, taking care to examine considerations, specifically enterprise software, and understanding domain to design least disruptive, integrated, and frictionless software. His trial by fire experiences and being able to look back and retrospect with a sense of learning and amusement, and by sitting on different sides of the table through his career, understanding the whys of everything and getting into learning about the process behind decisions with the help of great mentors. He says why building software that's self-healing and has non-disruptive capabilities is important when you work with constraints in a startup, and about the composition of startup teams. There's a lot in this episode for our listeners, so tune in, folks.
Welcome to the Software People Stories, Sunil.
Thank you, Shiv. It's a pleasure to be here. Let's dive into your questions.
Okay. As I said, no, this is more of a conversation than a question. So
yeah, sure. Yeah,
primarily,
absolutely.
There are some questions triggered more by my curiosity in understanding Sunil the person.
Sure.
Where, this is not a tech talk. So
Sure.
from that perspective, even though you have been a techie all along, you've been an architect, you've been a startup entrepreneur, a lot of dimensions that you have.
Right.
So how did this all begin?
Well, it all began, the beginning, I did not design for my career in startups to be the way it was. The initial thing happened by chance, right? I graduated in 2001 in the midst of all the 2001 twin attacks and bombing and all that. And my on-campus recruitment the job I had through my campus recruitment, they had postponed their joining date and all that. So they temporarily put all the new candidates on hold. So I was stuck and I didn't know what to do at that point of time. My dad had a terminal cancer. So I did not want to go to the US at that point of time. I wanted to wait and see what happens. So, I was sort of forced to stay in Chennai. And at the same time, I wanted to do something, but the job that I had, we couldn't move forward with that. So it was at that time, one of my friends actually did a startup, right? And he was from College of Engineering, India, and fresh out of college, he did a startup. So he just said, hey, why don't you join me and see how it goes, right? Maybe your company will call you back 6-7 months down the line, and then you can make a choice whether you want to continue in the startup or you want to go and take that job. It's fine, right? Whatever it is, you can make your choice at that point of time. Now that you're sort of free, why don't you join and see what happens? So this thing happened by chance, right? And one of the things is even at school and when I was growing up, I was more into computers than the average person at that point of time, right? In school and in college, I learned coding pretty early, about 6th, 7th standard, starting with GW Basic and all that. And Pascal was a major I worked a lot on Pascal. So I started coding at a relatively young age because my dad was in an area where he knew that computers are going to be the next big thing. So he started pushing me into computers and all this at a very early. So that way, you could say that I was sort of very lucky, privileged, blessed in a lot of these things fell into place. My friends always knew that he knows computers and he knows programming and all that. So that's what sparked my friends' interest in asking me to join him, right? So it is some things, you sort of build a portfolio or something, and unknowingly you're building a portfolio, right? When you're starting to explore things in life, right? And without your own knowledge, you're building a portfolio actually. And people actually notice these things. You may not think too much of it. You are doing it for your own interest and you like it, but people actually make a note, and at some point it will come back and help you. Every little exploration that I've done, somewhere it's sort of helped me, even as a conversation starter with somebody, right? So all these things add up. And so coming back to the story, right, he asked me to join, and after working there for a month, I decided, I don't know how the job in the company that had offered me a job is going to be, but this sure is exciting, right? So we were building
Okay.
devices that were taking, heart measurements, right? An electronic stethoscope, if you could say that, right? And we
Okay.
were analyzing the signals to see if there are anomalies. Way ahead of its time, right? Way ahead of its time. But it was very interesting work, right? And it was very close to what I had studied in engineering in electronics and communication. It wasn't too coding heavy. It was very heavy on signal processing and neural networks and all that. So, I mean, it started off very exciting, right? I mean, it was like I thought, this is a good place to be. So I decided at the end of the first month that even if the job comes in, I'm not going to take it. And it never came. So it made my decision easier. So they never honored the offer. So it was fine. So that's how it started. So that's how I joined the startup, right? But at that point, I didn't know anything about a startup or anything, right? I mean, it was a startup in the sense that it was a bunch of guys who had, started doing something. That was my entry into startup. I would say it is chance, right? It's not like I planned my entire life to be in a startup or anything. It's just chance. But then the interest got picked after that, and it's like a drug, right? In the sense that once you work in a startup, and that adrenaline, that it's an invigorating experience in the sense that you are everything, you can contribute to everything that is relevant to the product. There's a lot of freedom in what you want to pick and choose, because it is always a case of lesser hands than what is required. So you can pick up many things, and if you are really interested, if you have a curious mind, right, then you will always like to work in a startup, right? I mean, you don't have to be some genius intelligence or high IQ person, right? I mean I'm just average, above average student. So all you need is a very, very, very open and curious mind, and then you will really be interested in a startup will be able to satisfy your sort of
Nice. Probably,
curiosity.
probably those days, even the term startup was not very popular. And
That's why I'm saying I'm very
yeah,
lucky, right?
right.
Extremely lucky,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I mean,
That brings a question of, from the time you started programming, you said GW Basic and all that,
right.
which we typically call as the programming in the small, right?
Right, right,
Compared to
right,
that, now there are too many things. Right out of college, you had to work as a team, and it is no longer just about software. Like you said, probably a lot of other things that were there, maybe integrating with devices, actually touching and feeling something that will host your software, right?
right, right.
How was that transition, or how did you
Well,
get adjusted to that or get acclimatized to that?
well, I was helped a lot by my peers, right? I was only one component of that company that joined, right? There are people who had worked in system side and all that who had also joined. And personally, I learned a lot from people around me. So that helped a lot, because you are right. I had a very sort of narrow mind of narrow vision about software, right? And it was very, very programming centric, right? It was very, very software centric. It was not systems oriented, but that was just the exposure I had at that point of time, right? But in college, I did pick up a few of my friends were into this kind of hardware interfacing with software kind of thing. So I did pick up a little bit there, but I never got really interested in it, because maybe I did not have that wiring for real hardware, right? Even though I was in electronics, that wiring wasn't there probably in me to pick it up at that point of time. But like you pointed out, it again, I would attribute it to learning after I joined the startup, right? It wasn't something that I knew when I joined the startup. I joined startup thinking that they picked me for something that I knew, right? And that was a very narrow tunnel vision of what I thought software was or what I thought programming was, right? but it turned out to be much bigger than that. And I learned on the job. But then, subsequently, every system that we built had a huge part of hardware. Though over time, the hardware design that we did in-house has reduced with the commoditization of hardware and components to such a huge extent in China and Taiwan and all that. But I did pick up a lot in my first startup in terms of this system side and interfacing with something that people can touch and feel, right? Because my tunnel vision software was something that was completely different, right? Human input through a keyboard or mouse was all I was aware of, right? And something running, reading something from a disk or a database and processing mounds of data. That was my idea of what software was, right? It was very different, and I was so wrong, obviously. But I did pick it up, right? Over time, I've picked up these things. That again, right? It's just exposure and an open mind, curiosity. I did not stick to the tunnel vision, obviously. I was very interested once I started to see these kind of systems that people build, where there is touch and feel and the way software interacts with other real components in life and all that. Obviously, I was very, very interested. So I did pick up these things as I moved in my career.
And also, as you were explaining earlier, your career has also been about architecting more of enterprise systems or systems that go in the background and all that. There are many more moving parts that may not even be visible to you when you're conceiving your solution.
Oh, yeah, of course. See, one of the biggest things about enterprise software is how and where you insert your software, right? Where it's going to run, what are the other sort of subsystems that it's going to talk to, and how disruptive or not disruptive it's going to be, right? And that becomes one of the pillars of architecting any product that you build for enterprise, because without that, it is meaningless, right? You cannot go and say, if you want to put my software, you have to change like 10 other things that are around it, right? You cannot put a disruptive solution inside an enterprise system, right? It has to merge in seamlessly, do its job, and also have a predictable way of providing value to the enterprise. It's a very, very tricky thing, like you said, right? Compatibility with other softwares, hardwares, all sorts of things will come into play. And a lot of standardization effort has gone on. But as you know, right, the way standards themselves evolve is somebody blazes a trail and then eventually that becomes a standard. So if you're at the cutting edge of technology, somebody is blazing that trail already, right? So it means that, you are always somewhere at some point working with something that is not so standardized and not sort of, it may not, there are challenges integrating with these kind of products and all that. But that is one of the challenges of the enterprise domain, like you rightly pointed out. And a lot of thought has to go into that. And much of the problems get solved with a lot of domain knowledge in a particular place. So one of the things that I realized with enterprise software is there is no one enterprise software, right? Even in enterprise, you have to have some sort of specialization because a domain is very important. Like over a period of time, networking has sort of become the domain that I've gone deepest into. And with that, I now understand how enterprise networking works and how to design products that are least disruptive and how to design products that work very well without having to touch other things, right? So, but that comes with a lot of experience, time, and spending a lot of time with customers and working on the field, right? One of the things that you get to do as a startup is if you get to a phase where your product actually gets sold, which is a big deal, trust me. So if you get to a stage where your product gets sold and gets deployed in a real customer environment, then if you're in a startup, you get that vital experience of being in that place where it's being deployed. You get that it's priceless. It's a priceless commodity in the sense that you experience being there and seeing how it is actually integrated, right? How it actually turns on and actually starts working in the enterprise. So this you can learn only if you're in a startup, because if you're in a big company and doing the same thing, right? There are layers and layers of support and value-added services and all sorts of teams that will come in and try to do that job. right? Which is not bad. I mean, that's the way those companies are organized. But that key piece of understanding you will not realize, right? Because typically what happens is a lot of people who are in this area where they actually go to the field and deploy, right? The field engineers, you could call them, right? They are not product minded. They don't have a vision of strategy or how you can take this, or how you can identify a hole there and sort of see if there is a product feature that is valuable that could add on to your product, which could make things much easier, right? As an engineer, if you have a feel, sort of flair for this kind of thing, if you get into the field, you can really learn a lot, right? And that will be direct feedback to you improving your own product, identifying areas in the future where you could work on, and give you a ringside view on how actually these systems are working in cohesion, right? And then you know how to sort of build something that can fit in that complex mesh of things that are there. So I think that's another benefit of working in a startup, is that you get the opportunity to actually be there and do it.
Yeah, very nicely put. In fact, one thing I've heard is that success, or at least not making mistakes, comes from experience,
Yes,
and experience comes from making mistakes.
absolutely. Absolutely.
So you have any stories of how you got this
uh,
experience? Maybe on the funny side also, to
Well,
make
I
it
mean,
lighter.
there are a lot of, at least the last couple of gigs that I did are all enterprise networking products, right? And they are in the line of fire, right? In the sense that if something goes down, actually it costs money, right?
Mm.
So, like a lot of times we've got off, we had our product running in a huge theater chain in US, and they're going to open booking in 5 minutes. Nothing seems to be working, right? And these kind of situations,
Mm.
uh, I mean, suddenly, like about five engineers debugging this problem, looking at different things, right? And suddenly somebody just says, hey, maybe there are duplicates out there in the network, right?
Oh.
Because it did not, nothing else made sense, right? And it turns out that we had gone and configured sort of duplicate IP addresses in different places and things like that. But the part that I wanted to emphasize is that in that we learned that these kind of things have to be avoided at the time of deployment. So you learn this, right? Nobody is going to come and tell you, hey, build this feature so that you can avoid all these kind of situations cropping up, right? It will not come from your product development. It will not come from sales. It will not come from marketing, right? Nobody wants this feature. It's not a feature actually, right? It is to protect your own ass, right? In the end, you don't want to be in the situation where somebody is going to open in 5 minutes and you don't know what the hell is going on, right? So as engineers, you come back, and that very night sort of we sort of built that thing where this will not happen again, right?
Mhm.
So I mean, a lot of these things is trial by fire. And like you said, right, it's always, if something bad happens, then for sure there is something extremely good that will get done out of that.
Mhm. Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, there are. I wouldn't say. I mean, at the end of it, right? Once we fixed it, the whole thing was very funny because it is just a huge set of stupid things that were done, right? An
Yeah.
accumulation of stupid things that were done that led us to that situation. It was very funny when we thought of what and all people have done to get us to that place. But at that point, it wasn't funny at all.
Absolutely.
And then,
I also want to talk about the other phase or the other aspect,
right,
which is, yeah, you said being startup, designing products and all that. But you've also been an entrepreneur, a serial entrepreneur, so to say.
well,
So the question is,
yeah,
the startups themselves, yeah, being part of a startup is one thing. Yeah, there is a team that finally puts everything together, you conceive things, etc. But as a startup or as a founder, co-founder, etc., there are a lot of ambiguities. You probably have to take some bets, you decide on some things, you believe in some things, which may be a little uncomfortable for the traditional engineering thinking, where we want everything kind of deterministic. We said we want to be able to specify everything, do everything, and it should work. Right?
right.
So how did you either get adjusted to that or acquire an aptitude for that?
I think one of the, I mean, Very interestingly, I always look at it as two sides of the table, right? Like you as a start, I've worked as a startup employee, a guy who worked in a startup, to a person who was a part of the first few people who joined the startup, to eventually becoming a co-founder, right? And
Mm.
so if you look at it, I've been sitting on the other side of the table first, right, as an employee, a startup employee, no different from a normal employee, and slowly I've moved to the other side of the table, right? So
Yes.
in this circle, I've learned, through this circle I've learned that there are, because everything that seems so anomalous to me, right? Like, hey, why aren't you buying this laptop? I need it, right? So to
Mm.
simple things like that, right? And to why we don't want to do it, right? I've made that full circle as to why probably somebody did not get that laptop, why we did not spend that money building that lab, right? Why we didn't spend that $50,000 buying a traffic generator at that point of time, it doesn't make sense as an engineer, right? Dude, we need this, right? What are you even thinking, right? And then you think about it, right? And when you come to that stage, you realize that, hey, you know what? Who's really asking you for that kind of performance right now? You're going into deployments that are much smaller scale where you know it works. You can push this out,
Mm.
right? But as an engineer, you don't take that answer. You are trying to build something, and you're scared, right? Because in startups, right, people, you don't know what is going to get thrown at you. Your feeling is, hey, what if I get deployed in that situation, right? How do I even, if I'm in that position where they put it in a deployment where it requires that kind of performance, what will I do, right? It's not a problem really.
Right.
It's a lot that goes into it when they say don't worry, right? Because a lot of times people have told me, hey, I'm going to do this. They say don't worry, don't do it now, right? So this don't do
Mm.
it now, let's do it later, right? It has always, that answer to me has always provoked some thought. So over time, the other thing is, I've also, like I said, right, I started as an employee of a startup, but over time I sort of became one of the founding members, if you could call that, right? Not founders or anything, but founding members, the first, within the first 5-10 people who joined the startup, right? That gave me access, very, very close access to the founders. And also I was lucky enough in the sense that after the success of a startup and all that, the founders became VCs.
Okay.
They became VCs, so I had access to them,
Mm.
right? And conversations, when you talk to these people, access to this kind of network is sort of something you build, right? And I mean, it is something that I wasn't aware of the value that I was getting from all this, because my CEO at the last startup that I was in and the previous one, they were very open with me, right? And they used to talk anything and everything, right? And they always used to say, hey, Sunil, one day if you're going to do this, remember, this is why, we are doing it this way, right?
Okay.
It will be helpful, right? And you pick up these things, right? So you converse, and you have the ability, you have the channel open with the real decision makers to go, and I'm sure they got irritated when I asked them, right? But a lot of times I've seen with people who are founders also, right, they would have followed the same process, they would have gone through the same cycle, so they are very, very forgiving when you go and ask them these questions, right?
Okay.
And they don't really, they might get irritated, what is his problem, why is he even bothered about that? But if they see that you are genuinely interested, right, not asking a question for the sake of asking a question, you are really interested in the process of the decision and why you came to the decision, they will take the time and they will entertain you, and they will give you their time and mind to give you a proper answer as to why it wasn't done the way you. So that is how I sort of bridged a lot of this gap, right? Because I learned from all these people I've been surrounded with, and they've always been very nice to me in the sense that they've always shared the process, right? They've always shared the process with me, and that has given me a huge fillip in terms of bridging the gap that you are talking about, right? Because as an engineer, I was like exactly what you said, right? You don't even know why people are doing these things, right? And
Mm.
the whole disconnect was so huge. But then you realize it's not actually a disconnect, it's just a process of decision making. And in startups, a lot of times the goal is to build, at least the kind of startups that I worked in, right? Again, there could be other sort of ways of doing this and all that. And there is no blanket, this is how it should be done, right? Sort of thing. But the kind of startups that I've worked in always had a time to market, right? There is a need for this product now and for the next few years. You have to get it out to the market as soon as possible. And there is a way to build these kind of products, right? And you cannot always make the best choices. You have to make the smart choices, identify the tech debt you are accruing so that you can go and fix it later, right? You have to be really smart about it. And as an engineer, it is completely opposite to anything that you want to do, right? Sometimes, right? This is not what you would do. It might look like cutting corners. It might look like shoddy work sometimes, but there is a method behind this madness. And over time, we have become extremely smart at making these decisions, right? How to build software quickly and yet achieve a certain level of performance and scale, and also know that there is a path to that ultimate performance and scalability that you know how to get to, right? That's the key. You always need to know how you have to get to a point, right? From a technology standpoint, right? As long as you know how to get there, you can get there. You don't always have to get there first to get something out to the market. So I mean, that's how sort of I learned. I think it was a long-winded answer. I don't know how it came out, but
Yeah, that's good. Actually, I'm curious to ask a trick question now.
sure.
Okay. While you say that time to market is probably what is going to guide a lot of things, and then getting something out there and all that, even within all these variables, is there something that you would consider non-negotiable?
Well, I think that depends on the software or hardware or the product you're building, right? In a lot of cases, I think the quality of the software is non-negotiable, right?
Okay.
In some cases, it is probably negotiable. I mean, like in the sense that, hey, if you are building an app that is giving you recommendations on movies to watch, right? If it times out a couple of times, it's okay, right? I mean, you may or may not lose customers because of that. But if you're building a software the kind of software that we build, a downtime means you're going to lose customers, right? So there is something that is non-negotiable in the sense that quality and the way you fundamentally consider of availability, right? In terms of software availability, right? How you build redundancy. I mean, that becomes fundamental to your product, right? Because software is software, right? It is bound to fail at some point of time. How quickly it can heal and how quickly it can sort of correct itself and become available again is sort of one of the key constructs. So that's non-negotiable in the space that I work in. Right? There could be other non-negotiables could change in the industries that you work in, right? But for example, like if you're in a big data or some machine learning space, the outcomes are non-negotiable, right? And you have to focus on that. That is the key. And this again, right? It's the question, the classic startup problem, right? If you have infinite money and infinite time, right, you can build the best product, right? But that's never the case, right? You have limited time and limited money in the kind of startups that I work. There are, of course, if you have a Google-like idea or something like that, the time constraint is a lot lesser, right? Because nobody is going to come into the market and beat you to the punch, right? So you have that amount of time, right? And if you have like an idea that is like way ahead of its time, it's going to take that amount of time to sort of become a reality and make sense to the market also. So these things change, right? But in the startups that I work, usually both are a constraint, right? And that's where the challenge is. And how do you do this is part of the most important sort of lessons that I've learned. And how to build software quickly without compromising quality, and always build reasonable scale and performance with an eye and an absolutely certain path to how I can get to the ultimate goal.
In your current team, do
Right.
you have freshers?
Okay. No, actually, that's a very interesting question. I in none of though I joined as a fresher, right? This is
Yeah.
the huge irony, right? The huge irony. I joined a startup as a fresher, but subsequently, the the two successful startups that I had, never hired freshers. And uh, I mean, I have my own theories to it, but that is the reality. And even in this startup, we don't have freshers, at least not in the India side of things. In the US teams had a couple of, I mean, again, this is not like we had a huge number of freshers joining us or anything. We at least had one or two, right, in the US side, but here in India, it was a zero, right? And this actually pains me a lot because I was a big beneficiary of such an opportunity, right? But I mean, it doesn't work out that way uh, because there is. I mean, I've tried my hand at recruiting freshers here. There are a lot of ground realities that are very, very, very that make it very difficult for me to hire freshers, and that's the reality, right? I mean, in
Yeah. In fact, this is a pattern I find in many other startups also. Primarily, one of the things that at least I try to simplify that as a gap between whatever our colleges produce today and what you need for a startup. I mean, you talked about the joys and the rewards of being in a startup,
right,
which also probably you were able to reap because you approached it in a particular way, or there were some things in the environment that helped you.
right,
uh, how do you think,
absolutely,
and this is not only for the freshers, even though I asked the question as now, do you have freshers? Many people that I've been talking to
mm,
also, when they have this mid-career crisis, so to say, or
mm,
after a few years, saying
right,
that I don't know what I'm doing, should I do something else? And then, okay, maybe I should start up or should join a
right,
startup.
right,
Then after a quick conversation, sometimes you feel that probably the personality or the kind of things that people are expecting, they may be disappointed if they get into a startup. So it may
okay,
not that it's not that everybody can get into a startup mode of thinking,
mm.
right? So from your experience, do you think there are maybe 3 or 4 trainable skills or acquirable skills that would make one more startupable, if there is a word like that?
Uh, so I think, I mean, to me, with exposure, anybody can be trained in anything. Honestly, I mean, at least the kind of see between working for SpaceX and working for normal startups, there's a huge gamut of startups and entrepreneurship that is there, right? It doesn't have to be rocket science, and there's a huge gamut of things, right? And in a lot of these places, you need people with curiosity, high energy, and the rest is all trainable according to me, right? That's, I mean, this is for people with a fresh mind, right? Fresh out of college, right? Just curiosity and an energy, the high energy levels to work and learn, right? If you have that, I think at least in the you could say that I can represent, let's say, 5% of the startup ecosystem, right? The kind of products that we build, and I've always worked in, right? That a lot of the other things are trainable,
Mm.
right? But if you don't have that, right, it is tough, fresh out of college. For the people with the midlife wanting a change, I'm bored with this, I want to change, right? The first thing is change for the sake of change is, I mean, that is the first mistake, right? In the sense that, hey, I've been here. You should have a path to what you want. And it is not sufficient to say, this is not what I want, right? You should also know what you want to a certain extent. I'm not saying that, hey, it's, I mean, it's very easy to say, I don't like this,
Mm.
right? So, and go to another place, right? What is the guarantee that you will like that, right?
Yeah.
It is very important to find out where you are going to also, right? And that is probably one thing that is, it's a philosophical thing more than anything. It's very difficult to gauge it in the individual also. But for the midlife thing, right, what I would suggest, what I think is more important, right, is an open mindset, right? Because there is a huge amount of unlearning that you will have to do. I'm not saying that, hey, this is a startup, everything will be very different. In the end, you're building the same software, right? Like I said, it's a constrained environment. That's it. You're building the same kind of software that you are building, But in a much more constrained environment, the constraints are more, and you have to be cognizant of these constraints, right? And as a senior person, you will be expected to be cognizant of these things, more than a guy joining fresh. Given that you've come with some, because people will expect you to know the constraints. I mean, hey, you're going to build this, but hopefully you know that these are the challenges that you will come across, right? So I think to that extent, you'll have to be open-minded in accepting that it's not going to be very different, but it will be very different in the sense that you will have to work in a constrained environment and build the same thing, but in a more constrained manner. So that, to that extent, you should have an open mind. And the other thing is, as much as I keep talking about depth, right? You need to have a certain level of breadth and knowledge also. That is, I mean, you can be deep in one area, but you cannot be shallow in anything, right? Over time, right? So that's another thing that becomes very critical for a startup, and which is why people at a senior level find it difficult to make the transition also, because they have worked in silos and they've become subject matter experts in some areas already, right? They're very valuable to a startup, but at a certain stage, once you've built the first level of the product and everything, right? And then where the product needs a certain guidance in a narrow area which is lacking in your existing team, that's where people can come in and help. So that's another path for people to leverage their subject matter expertise and join. But that's still a startup by their definition, but it's not a startup in the sense that it's not the early days. It's probably Series B, post Series B sort of thing, right? People will call themselves a startup even at that point. You can join those kind of startups where you will not have to unlearn so much, right? And you will be really valuable. But if you're really joining a startup, right? You cannot be shallow in anything. That's really the conundrum there, right? Because you have to know, you have to be a QA guy, you have to understand the web, you have to understand systems, depending on the kind of software you build, right from logistics to everything, you need to know a little bit about everything, right? You can't be blindsided completely in a particular area. So that is the conundrum. But I mean, like I said, right, again, if you have an open mind and you're willing to say that, hey, I have gone in a certain path, this is a different path, if I spend time, I can pick it up. If you have that open mindset, you can join a startup for sure. But like you said, startups also are very careful about hiring these kind of people, because they know that it may not work out, right? And in the sense that people know what they are looking for in the early stage of a startup, and they're looking for certain kind of individuals, that it is very difficult to get into that. So, I mean, at least the kind of places that I've worked in, right? The founding team sort of assembles itself, and then we go from there, right? And for a long time, we will be that, 10, 15 people before we sort of start hiring and becoming bigger, right? And the first 10, 15 people sort of hire themselves, and because they will come from another startup, they would have been sort of a Series B startup person who wants to get the experience of Series A, who's understood the mindset of working in a constrained environment. So those are the people who kind of join. So like you said, open mind is a definite necessity. But I think if you're looking to make a change, join a startup. Don't go to a day one startup as our first gig. It might not be your cup of tea.
Another one of my favorite questions, usually the last question, is with so much of automation and intelligence coming into software or software-based solutions, what is the future of software? If somebody is now looking at getting into software, or even probably taking up a course and then graduating for students, what do you see as the future for software? Of course, it's a very, very vast industry. It's difficult to say that, but still, you can hazard whatever you think.
I really even don't know how to answer that question, in the sense that it probably scares the living daylights out of me also. So I don't know what to answer there. But see, in the end, I'm not saying that automation, there will always be something for software engineers to do. I think automation always has its place, right? And that is not going to stop us from building things. Because if you look at the history of automation, right, you can only automate things that you know very well. So you build something, and over years you have honed it to a T, and then you go and automate it. in that process, the key part is you're always building something new. So I trust that mankind will keep building something new, and you can always sort of get into that bandwagon and keep going, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, like industrial automation took years. Today, an automobile plant will probably employ 3,000, 4,000 people. In my dad's days, it was 30, 40,000 people, right? But it has taken them 60 years to get to that point, to the point that they know exactly what needs to be built and the specifications, everything, right? So you just put in, and the whole thing is so automated that it comes out exactly like what you expected, and probably better because it's made by machines, right? But to get to that level, automobile has been a fun ride, right? For people, they've spent years and years excited, building things, new things. And now there are newer things, right? Which require human innovation, right? I mean, till a time where these machines start thinking on their own and start building things themselves, right? I mean, if it comes to that, then we don't know. We are going to be competing with those kind of machines and compute to build something new. But even then, you will be competing with somebody to build something new, right? So it's fine, right? I mean,
good. On that positive note, that we still have a lot of career options and a lot of opportunities that open up, maybe new opportunities. I think that's just about the time we have for this conversation. And
thanks a lot.
Yeah, it's been very interesting. I think a lot of things which we can catch up some other time.
Sure, absolutely. I'm open. You can reach out to me anytime, and I'd love to share my experiences for whoever it is useful for, right? So.
Yeah, absolutely. It will be. I think all of us go through these things, and when you hear either similar things that somebody else has done or gone through, or maybe different, at least there is that reassurance.
Oh yeah. I've learned a lot by just listening to people, right? I mean, in the end, some of it connects, some of it doesn't connect, but I always make a point to listen.
We thank Siddharth for the music and Malavika for promoting the Software People stories.
If you like this episode,
please subscribe on your favorite podcast client
and spread the word in your network.
If you'd like to share your story,
contact us at podcasts@pm-powerconsulting.com.